Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a webinar hosted by Didomi and Jellyfish. We're going to be speaking today about mastering the Microsoft consent mode. So by way of introductions, my name is Jeff Wheeler. I'm the Global Vice President of Product at Didomi. So I run our global teams for our CMP products, or scanning products, and our user choice products. And with me is François, and I'll give it to him to introduce himself and introduce Jellyfish.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. So hello everyone. My name is François. I've been working at Jellyfish for 10 years, and I'm currently in charge of the analytics team. The analytics team is within the MarTech department. So the MarTech department means that I've been working closely with the team in charge of cloud subjects and also experience optimization. And if I am to present Jellyfish quite quickly, we are a digital partner. We are working on media, creative, and data topics. And within the analytics team, we focus on creative, the most effective data collection framework. We focus on relevant analysis assets, and we try to deploy powerful activation use cases for our clients. So I'm very happy to be here with Didomi. That's a key partner for us and the key topic that we work with for all of our clients on getting the most of the privacy options that they have.
Great, thanks, François. And I'm sure as many of you know, but I'll introduce Didomi very quickly. We're a French-based CMP that offers global multi-regulation consent platforms. We also specialize in preference management, user choice, advanced compliance monitoring. We're also compliant and secure with many frameworks in the industry. Google, the IAB framework, GPP framework in the US, as well as being ISO certified. So we really specialized specifically around user choice and consent. Let's hop into the agenda really quick and just take care of some general housekeeping items. So for today, we're going to be spending some time talking about, obviously, Microsoft consent mode and the technical insights, how Microsoft consent mode balances compliance performance, the key benefits, the latest updates and impact on strategies. We'll spend some time. François will help us go through the implementation guide, and then we'll end up talking a little bit about navigating consent and the consent mode ecosystem. So before we get into the specifics, just a couple of things of housekeeping. You'll see some Didomi team members on the chat. Feel free to interact with them. There's also a question tab. Please ask lots of questions. Both François and I would love for this to be more interactive than us just presenting slides. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can. And if we can't get to those questions, we'll make sure to follow up. Also, this recording will be, or this webinar will be recorded. And so Clara, who's part of the Didomi team, will be able to help share all that out after the webinar. So with that being said, ask away. We'll try to stop the webinar once we see questions and ask them or answer them best we can. Okay, so Microsoft Universal Tracking and Consent Mode. So this is kind of a follow-up to what Google has done. It's obviously very separate. This is Microsoft's version of what they've done. It's kind of a general direction in the industry that we're starting to see. So the use of consent mode. So three main use cases that we see specifically around consent mode are conversion tracking. So this allows you to track sales and custom events like form submissions, newsletter signups, and define what conversion means to the campaign. Adding robust data layers, so deploying data layers to capture key data points, page category, transaction value, card items, user ID, and then use detailed insights to refine those marketing strategies. And then precise marketing, so this building remarketing lists from tracked user activity, target ads to specific customer agreements, and focus ad spend on potentially converting viewers. We hop into the next slide here. So the use of consent mode. Again, very kind of in-depth use cases here, specifically with consent. And François, feel free to drop in with any comments you have here doing this right. So optimize with automated bidding. So this is going to integrate specifically with the Microsoft Ads data with advanced bidding algorithms, monitoring and adjust bidding campaigns for a better ROI. Maybe one point to call out here, and I'm sure François will get to this later on, is one slight difference between the Google consent mode and this one is this is specifically just for ad data, where consent mode has a couple different data points that can be captured. This also allows you to balance privacy and marketing consent mode, so you can modify the UET tags based on consent. You can anonymize data for better opt-outs, full data collection for consents, while maintaining user trust and monetizing advertising. Again, as we're talking about some of these things, keep in mind the data modeling will be a big part of this, and again, it'll be something that François will talk about here in a little bit. And then leveraging for marketing success. So transforming your privacy into a marketing advantage, enhancing tracking, optimizing strategies, maintaining trust, and then explore and integrate into your strategy. You want to use this to explore your strategy, right? So this is not something that's standalone. It's something that you should be doing kind of in conjunction with the rest of the kind of consent and marketing experience that you guys are hopefully you guys are using on your different tech stacks. So how does Microsoft consent mode work? So a user will visit a web page. Ad storage will be set to denied, and this is specifically for the EU right now, EU and the UK. The UV tag will block the ads, and then first-party cookies won't be read yet. Third-party cookies are only read for fraud and spam, and then a consent banner is shown. So this is all kind of happening behind the scenes before the banner is shown. Once consent is either granted or denied, you kind of have two user flows here, where third-party cookies are only read, again, for fraud and prevention purposes. There's no real data being tracked or being passed, no PII or anything like that, and no conversion tracking. So this is also slightly different than what you see from like a typical CMP integration, where you go into the tag manager and you just really block the tag or don't block the tag. So consent mode is kind of allowing a little bit more flexibility and making sure that not every little piece of data is being lost. And then obviously consent granted is allowing both the first and third party cookies to be read and written with UET, and then obviously moving on to conversion tracking. Yeah,
maybe one thing that we can flag here is that, as you mentioned, there is only one purpose with the Microsoft version of the consent mode, where in Google you had several, and but that doesn't mean the purpose is called ad storage, and there is a purpose that is called ad storage within the Google framework. That doesn't mean that these are necessarily the same purpose. So there is a step that is very important for you as a client. This is to check with your legal team whether or not the current purpose that you are using for Google's consent mode, for example, or any other ad purpose, can be applied to the understanding of the interpretation of Microsoft on that same purpose. The advantage that there is with this version with Microsoft is that they are using the transparency consent framework. So if you are using that, and if you already agreed with your legal team that you can use that as a frame of reference, you can keep using that, and that will just apply.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the input. We do have a question. Now might be a good time to do it before we get to the next section. So Matteo is asking, do we know if Microsoft plans to introduce other consent signals like the ones in consent mode v2? I know from the Didomi side, we work really closely with Microsoft as a partner, and they reached out when they first launched this. We haven't seen any details yet of a v2 of consent mode, but similar to Google, I would expect over the coming months and years that we'll see advancements in their version of consent modes, as long as other companies offering consent modes, which we'll kind of discuss a little bit later. But as of now, as far as I know, and François, if you hear something different, please chime in. I don't think there is concrete plans for that.
Yeah, I have the same feedback as you have, and as far as I know, nothing is planned. I think it's still an interesting question, but because we see that there's going to be that issues with different purpose that can be used, and we'll see a little bit later what could be the implications of your setup. So I'd say my answer is, even if there isn't, you should plan like there would be. So you should have a setup where if there is some additional purpose that is mapped, the setup will still continue to work, because that's something, even if that's not short term, that's something that's likely to happen either for Microsoft or for any other gatekeepers that will join later.
Yeah. Great question, though. Thank you for that. Okay, so kind of a next question that we've been asked quite a bit as Didomi has launched this, and we've seen is this mandatory? It's a great question. So I think there's kind of a two-part answer to this. From my opinion, so there's a pure compliance standpoint of is this mandatory, and I think the simple answer is no. There's nothing saying within any of the GDPR or the regulators that we've seen that you have to use Microsoft consent mode or Google consent mode or anything like that. Now the question becomes, if you are using, Microsoft advertising on your site, if you're using any of the Microsoft products, is it mandatory? Kind of the short answer is yes. You do want to be able to make sure that these are being used so you don't lose things like data modeling and some of the insights you get through consent mode. But the caveat there is also kind of depends on where you're from. So if you're hosting like a GDPR notice and your traffic is entirely in the US, you don't need to use consent mode in the fact of doing it. But if you have something in the EU or the UK, then yes, you should be using consent mode, both Google and Microsoft, as part of your framework plans in terms of how you integrate with your CMP. Let's see. Looks like let me just double check the chat, make sure we're not missing anything. All right. Okay. So I think François, this next section is your section. So I'll hand it off to you and mute my microphone.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So on this next section, the first section that we cover together now is the implementation guide. So concretely, how can you use Didomi to make sure that you have consent mode correctly implemented for Microsoft solutions? So we'll look into that first, and then we'll take a little bit of a step back to look at, because we've had Google consent mode, now we have Microsoft consent mode. We've had some options with TikTok, with Meta. So we look at everything that the gatekeepers are currently doing in terms of complying with the DMA for themselves. And we'll try to understand what this could mean for the future of measurement and what are the key takeaways that as an analyst, as a tracking specialist, we could look at and have in mind for the future of our setups. So let's begin with the implementation guide. So as a first step, before we go into the details of what you should do. So first off, you'll see that it is quite simple, and if you've been in depth with Google consent mode, that's just an easier version of Google consent mode. But I'll just remind the basics. So as it is the case for Google, you will find that there is a combination of default comment and an update comment. The main difference is that they both need to be pushed into a specific array, which is UETQ, and this array has nothing to do with the data layer. So the thing that was simple with Google consent mode is you could interact with GTM APIs or with the data layer to get the commands. Now you have to interact with a specific array that is set by Microsoft. So basically, the order that you'll need to have is to set the array first. See, this is what you can see on the first line of the first block. Then you'll need to push the default command. Then you can call the library and the main tag, and then you can do the update if you need to do the update and have the different events that go through. Whichever comes first, so that means that you could have events that are pushed before and then the update command that comes in, and that's fine. The consent will be retroactively passed to the event that were fired before. So this is quite similar to what Google is doing. So now having this in mind, we'll start with working on the Didomi consent notice. So once you are in the Didomi solution, the first thing that you want to make sure is that you have the Microsoft vendor that is added to your consent notice. If you don't have the Microsoft vendor, you'll need to add it anyway when you try to activate the integration. So this is the first thing that you should check. This is an information that you can find in the consent notice, then the name of your notice, and then you go into regulation and you can edit vendors and purposes depending on the regulation that applies. So that could be GDPR or whatever regulation applies to that specific consent notice. There is also, and we'll see that a bit later, there is also an option to use the transparency consent framework to communicate consent to the Microsoft solutions. So if you want to use that, obviously you need to have TCF that is activated at the notice level. So once we've made sure that we have the Microsoft vendor, we can enable the integration in the Didomi console. So the option for the integration is on the same page where you will find Google consent mode integration. So that's customization once you are in your notice, customization, integrations, and then you have to click on advertising. There's a little tab on advertising, and you'll find the list. Within the list, there is Google consent mode, but there is also the Microsoft consent mode. When you tick the main box, the one that is on the top right in the screenshot, that means that Didomi will activate the update command for Microsoft consent mode. So you'll make sure that the update command is activated, and the consent status that is passed with this update command will be the one that is mapped with the Microsoft vendor that we've just added to the notice. You have other options that you can use when you are working with integration. You can set the default status. That means that Didomi, as soon as Didomi is called, Didomi is going to call the default command. So my recommendation is to use that option only if you are completely sure of the order that Didomi is fired compared to your tag management system, because you don't want the default command to be fired halfway through the data layer events, for example, because you want to be sure that the default commands is one of the first thing that fires. So my recommendation is, if you are not sure of the order of firing between the tag management system and Didomi, you'll just fire the default command from the tag management system. And if you are sure, you can use that option. You have a sub option within that, which is to force consent. That means that the default command will pass the consent to granted, whatever the user choice is. That may seem a little bit crazy as an option, but this is something that you could leverage if, for example, you know that you are only going to fire the tags within the tag management system. If you have consent, you could make sure that the consent is set to granted with the default command. So that's an option. That's a niche option, but that's an option that you could use. But be very careful if you want to use that option, because obviously that means that the consent status is going to be decorrelated from the user choice from a Didomi perspective. And then you have to rely on the setup that you have in the tag management system. And then you can enable the transparency consent framework integration. So obviously, that means that the TCF needs to be enabled also at the notice level. If it's not the case, the option will be unavailable. So let's imagine that you don't want to handle the default command with Didomi, and that you want to handle the default command within your own tag management system. So I took the example of Google Tag Manager because that's like obviously the main used one, but that could be other tag management system. In the case of Google Tag Manager, there is an event that is dedicated to consent resolution, which is consent initialization. You can use that event, and I've taken the example of the template for consent mode, for Google consent mode, that was created by Simo Ava. So you have a bunch of templates that you can use. You have a Didomi one. Why I took the example of Simo's template is because it created an integration within that template to push the default command from Microsoft. So you can just check the box, map the variable to have the value for consent, and it will just fire the default command from GTM. So that's quite simple. Obviously, you can do it otherwise. You can just do a custom HTML if you want, and you can edit Didomi's template if you're into template edition. So there are a lot of options that are available. whatever you do, my suggestion is that you create a variable that gets consent information from the cookie and not from the data layer variables, as it is sometimes the case with the setups, because when the consent information is retrieved from the cookie, that means that it is available regardless of the timing of Didomi's firing or not. So you will have the information as soon as possible on the page. Didomi's cookie is called Didomi token, and the token it's quite easy to decrypt and then to just interpret. So you can use GTM to do that. So maybe any questions so far? Or I'm gonna check quickly the.
Yeah, François, it looks like we have 4 or 5 questions. I believe we answered one. Let's double check. Samuel asked if there's a Microsoft GTM template for the consent from and to pass. I believe you just covered that one. I don't know if you have any other comments to add to that question.
So I'll start with, you mentioned that's Joy's question. What if we have Google
so it's actually on the chat tab, Samuel's question. Is there a Microsoft GTM template for consent mode to pass?
I'm not sure. I don't know if there is. To be honest, I don't know if there is. I'd say if your use case is to handle the default command for both Google consent mode and Microsoft consent mode, my recommendation would be to use Simo Avast template. That's like one of the most robust templates on the market. This is an individual, but this is someone that is widely recognized as an expert in the industry. So that's my recommendation. Possibly there could be a template for that is directly from the Microsoft team, but I haven't tried it myself. But you have to understand also that what we have to push, that's like 4 lines of code. So you could just as easily do a custom HTML if you don't use already the template from Simo or whichever template. You could just as easily do a custom HTML. That's just as fine.
Great. See other questions. If we have Google Consent Mode already installed, is the master UET consent mode mandatory?
Yeah. I'd said so. Google Consent Mode is only going to apply to Google solutions, and Microsoft Consent Mode is going to apply to Microsoft solutions. So while I agree that it's confusing that they are using the same name for a mechanism that is very specific to their respective solutions, if you are working with Google solution, you'll need to have Google Consent Mode, and if you are working with Microsoft solution, you'll need to have Microsoft Consent Mode. But we see in the documentation, and this is something that I've not completely looked at, but we see in the documentation from different gatekeepers that they are trying to find ways to align on the Google Consent Mode. So it's possible that in the future we see a compatibility between Google Consent Mode and other gatekeepers, because it just makes sense. Almost everyone is using Google Consent Mode because they are using Google solutions, and Google Consent Mode is mandatory. So that's a possibility. But I'd say you need to make sure and use the built-in one and the native one from Microsoft. And then once you have secured your investment on Microsoft, and if there is a clear announcement from Microsoft, you can try to align with Google Consent Mode. That's something that could happen in the future.
Yeah, and to add on to that, and I think Sebastian, this will also answer your question of using not using the IAB with Didomi. The question is, what about if you're not using the Didomi IAB, but instead of using a custom setting for the vendor? So right now in the Didomi solution, you're required to use the IAB, the Microsoft IAB vendor. That's the way we built it. But as a teaser, and I think this will also kind of help with the first question on is it mandatory, is there is some upcoming releases from the Didomi team on what we're calling privacy signals. And what we're trying to achieve here is creating a method to where these types of integrations are much easier and can be the signals can essentially be translated into something that can be read that's not going to be so dependent on the IAB or specifically maybe one version of consent mode, of one of the consent modes, because again, a little bit of teaser as we get to later, we'll be talking about some of the other players in the space that are talking about similar things. And so that will allow the CMP to take some of that out of your hands to make that implementation integration a little bit easier. Great. And then lastly, I apologize, I would butcher the name, but the question is, not having Microsoft consent mode, does it affect campaign performance?
Yeah, so that part is unclear from Microsoft in terms of campaign performance. What is certain is that if you don't have consent signals, you will lose functionalities within the Microsoft platforms. So there is some activations that won't be available, and the purpose that can be attached to the add storage definition that they have. That means that you won't be able to use those functionalities anymore. So there's definitely a big impact in not using it or using it incorrectly.
Great. One more question came through. Let's answer this one, and then we'll get back into the rest of your presentation. So David is asking, can I use the CMO Ahava template only to manage Microsoft consent mode? I already use other systems for Google consent mode and would like to avoid overlaps.
Yeah, in that case, my recommendation is just to do custom HTML and just write the 4 lines of code that is necessary for the default command, because yeah, with CMOS template, I don't think that CMOS template can be used without Google consent mode, because it was first created for that. So I'm not sure that this is, even in terms of performances, that's not something that would be logical to do. So my guess is just do a custom HTML and write the default command. So that would be the code on the first slide that I presented, and you'll be fine. Cool. So moving on with the presentation. So once you've handled the default command, the next step for you is to publish the notice and of course validate the publication. So at this stage, you can safely publish the notice. So you need to go to, still you are in my notice, you need to go to publish, and then you can add your target domain if it's not already there, but usually it will be there, and you can click publish. One thing to have in mind is that sometimes you'll have changes that are pending, and once you publish, you publish all the changes that are pending. So before you implement Microsoft consent mode, you want to make sure that there are no changes that are pending on that specific notice, because that could be an issue. Also, there is something that we'll see a bit later on, but I'm spoiling it. Is that if you add the Microsoft vendor for the first time, that means that you will have to make some decision on consent recollection. Because let's say that, for example, I didn't have Microsoft vendor in my notice, and then I add it. That means that every user that consented to every vendor except Microsoft. And Microsoft will still be disabled as a vendor. So this is something that you can manage at the notice level within Didomi. You can choose a date for consent recollection. So you can force a date, let's say, for example, the day before, the day after. Or you can set a number of days before the consent is recollected for those users, and you can, if you set that parameter to 0, that means that consent will be collected immediately. You need to tread carefully with that, and this is an important decision. If having the Microsoft vendor is something new to your notice, this is an important decision, and this is something that you should check with the Didomi stakeholder that you speak to. If what could be the impacts in doing one of those options, but you need to align on this. Once you've published the notice, so I'm working with clients, I know that sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand if the notice have indeed been published, if the version that they are looking at on their computer is the correct one. So a quick tip: there is a Didomi JavaScript API that is quite useful with a lot of information. So you can just use that API to get information on the current notice that you have on your computer. So for example, if you use didomi.getUserConsentStatus for all .vendors.enable, that will give you the list of all the vendors that are currently enabled for your consent status. And if you use didomi.getconfig.integrations.vendors.microsoft, that will tell you if the Microsoft consent mode integration is enabled, and it will tell you if the TCF option is enabled as well. So now moving on with how to validate that Microsoft data collection is indeed affected by the changes that you've made. So what you want is to make sure, as it was the case with Google Consent Mode, you had the GCS and GCD parameter in the hits that you could check to make sure that consent mode was actually enabled for in the context. So you can do exactly the same thing with Microsoft. So you can go into the network tab within the DevTools, and in the network you'll be able to look at Microsoft hits. So to check for Microsoft hits, I think you just have to tab to look for bat.bing.com. And within those hits, you will see one of two situations. So if you are using TCF, you will see a TCF parameter that has a bunch of parameters, but inside there should be a parameter that is AS for add storage, and that parameter should be set to granted if there is indeed consent for a Microsoft vendor. So if you have AS equals G, that means that consent mode is active and you have consent that is passed with that event. If you have AS equals D, that means that consent is denied. And if you are not using TCF, the parameter will be a standalone parameter that will be ASC for add storage consent, and the parameter will be set to G if the consent is granted, and it will be set to D if the consent is denied. If you are filtering on bat.bing.com, you will see that there is a bunch of different calls that Microsoft is making, and every time there is a consent status, either the default or the update, that Bing will make a call. Microsoft will make a call to communicate that consent status. So if what you are looking for is to debug the status of your individual events, you want to look at the parameter EVT that is going to give you the name of the event. So page load is the generic event that is associated with the library load. But then if you have events like add to cart or whatever events you have, you will be able to check for it with the EVT parameter. And then again, Microsoft also has a useful JavaScript API that you can use. So if you want to validate the consent status that you have from a Microsoft point of view within the page, you can still go to the DevTool on the console. And within the console, you can type uitq.uitqconfig.consent. That will give you the state of the consent. And if you are using TCF, uitq.uitconfig.tcf, and that will give you the state of the integration with TCF. So you will see whether or not the TCF is enabled, and if there is consent, etc., etc. So this is also something that you should check, because once the notice is published and after you've given consent with Didomi, if a Microsoft tag has fired, you should have, typing those commands, you should have consent that is set to true. So now we've seen that the steps are quite simple. What could go wrong with this implementation? So the first thing is if you opt for the option of having Didomi pushing the default command, and that Didomi comes in after, a bit late within the data layer timing, you could be in a situation where the default command fires a bit too late because some events have already fired. So this is something that you want to avoid. So again, use the option of Didomi pushing the default command only if you are completely sure of the timing between Didomi and the tag management system. If you decide to push the default command yourself, use Didomi cookie. So this is something I already mentioned. If you have to add Microsoft as a vendor, you might need to recollect. Again, I told you before. And if you work with another TMS and GTM, you may need to dedicate an event to consent or resolve it before the TMS start evaluating events. So this is something that we see sometimes where the first event of the TMS will both try to resolve consent and then we'll try to also fire different libraries or fire page view events. So you want to have separate state for that and make sure that the TMS only starts dealing with events, with actual on-page events that you want to track after consent has been resolved. So there could be there are a bunch of different options with different tag management system, and you need to find the one that fits your setup. Okay, so are there any questions on that implementation guide before we move on to the next section on consent and gatekeepers?
Yeah, François, there were two questions. So I'll do Samuel's first. Is Microsoft consent mode only for Microsoft ads, or does it apply to Microsoft Clarity, for example, with an analytics storage consent parameter to send?
So as far as I can tell, it only applies to the Microsoft advertising solutions. I haven't tried it with Clarity, but that should be easy to verify, because if that applies to Clarity, you should have something that looks like the parameter that I've shown before. You should have the same for Clarity. So if you see no difference, you can test, and you can use Clarity with consent denied and consent granted. And if you see no difference, that means that there is indeed no impact. But as far as my experience goes, I haven't seen any impact on Clarity. So next question is Microsoft consent mode only for Microsoft ads? Yeah, no, okay, so that's the same one, sorry. If we implement Microsoft consent mode for conversion tracking, okay, so two different persons ask the same question. So I guess that answers.
Yeah, the next one is how would you set up consent mode on a single page application?
Yeah, so on this case, the fact that it's a single page application doesn't change much. That means that the default command needs to be fired at page load. So that would be the first page load, and then the update command as soon as there is consent. So the fact that the default command happens soon, that doesn't change the fact that you'll need to have an update command that comes in soon after. So if the scenario is that you can have several pages that are looked at before the user consents, in that case, that means that all the events are going to be impacted by consent retroactively, because basically what's happening with Microsoft consent mode, and this is the same for Google consent mode, is that you have an identifier that is put for the user, but that this is written as a JavaScript variable. And this is not written into a cookie, but this is as a JavaScript variable. So that means that you'll still have an identifier for every hit that fires, even if the consent is denied for those hits. And if the user consent, let's say after the third page, and after having the default command at denied, there will be a hit that fires, and that says that for that specific identifier, consent is not granted, and that there is that the identifier has been put into a cookie. So that also means that I'd say the implication is more for your legal team, because that also means that somehow these solutions, this is the same for Google, they have a way of carrying an identifier within a single customer journey, and from page to page. And the fact that it's a single page application, that's a technical specificity, but that means that you still are storing information within the browser, and whether or not storing in the JavaScript variable is storing into a browser according to GDPR, that's up for you to decide, or for your legal team. But that's not a partner that can tell you that, and that's not Microsoft or Google. That's your interpretation. I hope that answers the question there. Oh, and we have Ophélie. Hi, Ophélie, in the chat that says that it's actually going to apply for Clarity. So there you have the answer. So consent and gatekeepers. So the idea of this next section is to take a step back and look at what is the situation with most gatekeepers. So I started with looking at what each gatekeeper do. So this is not an extensive research on my part. This is just skimming the documentation of the main gatekeepers. So obviously I've excluded Apple because they don't have advertising solutions that apply, but looking at the main gatekeepers outside of Apple, I've looked at some trends, and one of the key trends is by now, all of them have an option to update consent or tamper with consent in some way within their library. So the options could be very different, but they all offer an option to communicate consent in some way within the front libraries. And then when we look at other work, we see that it differs. All the information will impact the setup and the capacities, and we see that Google and Microsoft, they have the most advanced mechanism when where you have a specific purpose that are being sent, and it impacts clearly both activation and modeling. And then you will have Meta and TikTok that have simpler integrations where you can basically, so for Meta, you can basically stop sending it. So if there is a command that is revoke consent, if you use that command, just no it that fires on although the library is loaded. And for TikTok, you can use a command that I don't remember. I think it's disable cookie, TTQ disable cookie. And that's just going to delete cookies if you have cookies. And it's just going to send it, but with the value for the user empty. And so these are way simpler consent mechanism, but this is something that they didn't have before the DMA information. So that's definitely them trying to adapt to that specific piece of regulation. And we have Amazon that sits a little bit in the middle because it looks like in their documentation, they have mapped individual purposes as well, but they rely mainly on the transparency consent framework, as far as I can tell. But Amazon is the solution that I know the least out of all of those. So what does this tell us in terms of what we should do for our setup? So the first consequence is the way that the tools are positioned. Historically, when the market started to use consent management platforms, data layers and tag management system were already around, and basically the consent management platform were added on top of an existing framework of setting up a data layer, having a tag management system that fires, and having event pushed into the data layer. So one thing that we can notice is that the CMP and the tag management system, they work asynchronously. So that means that even if they fire close to one another, even if the CMP fires first, it could some operations could still resolve later after some other operations from the tag management system have occurred. So you have a scenario where you don't control exactly the relative timing between the two solutions. Something that we can imagine in the future is that tag management starts to be more and more a dependency of consent management. A concrete example of that, there is an option actually within Didomi. Within Didomi, you can use the function Didomi on ready. And if you use the function Didomi on ready, this is a function that's going to be called only once Didomi is completely loaded and consent has been resolved. So we could imagine a setup where setting up the data layer and pushing the on-page events into the data layer is delayed until Didomi on ready is called. And that would mean that Didomi is structurally the first thing that applies, and then tag management is basically a dependency of that. So this is something this is not something that we see widely, but this is something that we could see more and more in the future. The second implication, another consequence, is the way that we build data model. Historically, basically, data models were just page view and then other events. And on page view, you had library that is loaded and then the page view event that is sent, and all happens a little bit at the same time. Already in GTM, what we see is that there is a dedicated timing for consent resolution. And this is also something that other tag management could replicate or adapt in some way. And we could imagine library loading and consent resolution happening first for big partners, and then page view and events happening only after, or being sent server side. The server side example, I think, is a good one, because if you are sending data through server side, that means that you need to have consent information that is resolved first, and you need also in some cases to have library that are being fired, because, for example, the Facebook library will need to be fired to recognize the click identifiers or to read the cookies, stuff like that. So we still are in a situation where you could need some libraries to fire on the client side before making the decision of sending or not sending data into your server container. So talking about server side, let's see how server side can help. With server side, we can transport each hit with specific consent and consent vendor by vendor. So that means that we can basically send every hit to the server side and then let the server side decide. So in that example, if I have a consent that is transported with the hit for Google and Microsoft, I could send data to both those vendors and not send data to Meta because I don't have consent. But this is also something that we could imagine with the purpose granularity, because we see that we start to have standards. The transparency consent framework is a standard for individual purpose and very granular purpose. And we see that gatekeepers, at least Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, start to identify consent as specific purpose. So we could imagine that all the data is sent with the specific purpose, and then we can decide what data points we want to send to each vendor depending on the purpose. This is actually a huge change, because at the moment, if you apply the logic, the basic CMP logic that we apply at the moment on the client side, if you have only 2 purposes out of 3 for a vendor, that means that the vendor will not be enabled by the CMP and the tag will not fire client side. If you take that logic server side, that means that you can still make the choice of sending part of the information to a vendor because you have identified specific purpose that can be activated. And of course, that means also that consent is no longer something that is dedicated to the client side. This used to be something that was very specific to client-side operation, with the use case that is, if I have consent, I can fire the tags. If I don't have consent, I will not fire the tags. But we are now seeing that the gatekeepers' obligations is something that will impact probably the entire industry. And we are already seeing that consent signals need to work in greater systems. So with the granularity that they carry, purpose by purpose, they need to move further into all of your marketing workflows, including offline. So in the example that I've put there, you could have information that comes from your physical store that comes into your CDP or your data lake or whatever you call it in your cloud platforms. Those information could have some processing that is done within the cloud platform for which you need to define purposes. And then that information could be uploaded into the platforms for, again, specific activations. For all of that, you need to have consent. You need to have consent that is specific to the operations that you want to do. And you need to have consent that is up to date. So that is a technical challenge. And this is something that tells us that consent is probably going to be something more important in the future than just the result of clicking on your banner on the website.
Great, thanks, Francois. I think one interesting thing on that last slide, if we go back really quick too, is we're talking about different systems and the idea of where consent is stored, but it's also the methods of getting consent. I think everyone in the industry is starting to see that beyond cookie consent on web pages, there's so many avenues for collecting consent and how they flow into those systems. So you've got mobile apps, native apps, you got CTV, gaming systems. it's almost endless at this point. And so really these frameworks are helping to solve that. Obviously Microsoft, the Amazon ones that you spoke about earlier, or web only right now. That'll be another interesting thing to see, in 6 months or a year. Does the Microsoft consent mode start to apply to different platforms, kind of following the path of what Google did. So great topics here. Okay, we have 8 minutes left. We don't have any questions as of now. Let me pause here just for a minute and give you guys a chance to ask any last questions. If not, we can kind of move on to wrapping up. Don't see anyone typing in the chat or on the question thing, so kind of go through these next couple slides, and if one pops up, we can answer real quick. So, as we wrap up here, everyone, I would just like to take this moment to thank you guys all for joining. The interaction and the questions have been great. It's always better for the presenters when we can answer those questions and have discussions versus presenting. So, thank you for joining. As a quick reminder, as we wrap this up, we have another Didomi hosted webinar on February 4th. It's exploring data privacy trends for 2025. If you guys have been following us on LinkedIn, or if you've kind of followed what we're doing, our CEO, Roman, who's on that webinar, has had some really great insights as to what those trends are. So I'd encourage you guys to register for that webinar and hopefully learn something new. If you do have any follow-up questions, specifically about Microsoft consent mode, either for Didomi or Jellyfish, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to follow up with anything else. And that being said, François, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, everyone.